Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Do I talk over here? Do I talk over there? I really like this layout, by the way. We organize a conference every year, and we're far too anally retentive to try something like this. This is really cool, yeah? Now I know I'm in South Africa. I've only been here a day, and I'm learning a whole new language, load shedding. I think the whole world's going to learn about load shedding pretty soon, by the way. Just before I came on stage, the difference between now and now. You know, it's a real, it would be impossible for me to overemphasize what a pleasure it is to be back in South Africa. Back in South Africa. You will be appalled with me when I tell you that it's been 19 years and 11 months since I was last here. But I live in Chicago now, it's a long way away, yeah? But I can say that with accuracy that it's been 19 years and 11 months because my daughter, my eldest child, who is 19 years and 2 months, was conceived here. And in honor of that, her middle name is Africa. And it's a delight to her mother and I that she spent the first 10 years of her life going around very proudly saying, my middle name is Africa. I was made in Africa, you know? And then she got to the age of 10 and realized what being made in Africa means. And it was, Mum and Dad, that's gross, you know? But secretly, I think she's pretty happy. You know, I don't know there's another place in the world that is blessed with location like Cape Town. It's just incredible. I got in on Monday, so yesterday, beautiful day, very windy, but I went looking around Cape Town. I started off at Signal Hill. I got the Uber to drop. I don't want to walk up there, so I got Uber to drop me at top of Signal Hill. Brilliant view. And then I thought, I don't really want to walk all the way back along that road. And then next stop was like Victoria and Alfred waterfront. I could see it down there. I thought, I'm sure I can, this will only resonate with the local people. I'm sure I can just walk down that hill from Signal Hill to Victoria and Alfred waterfront. What a mistake, yeah? It looked like there were some paths and it was kind of crazy. At one point, I stumbled on a military installation. It's an old military installation there. Kind of went through a barbed wire fence. And then the last 100 yards was just on my arse all the way down to the bottom. But when I got to V&A Waterfront, I mean, that's just incredible. And the Museum of Contemporary Art, and that's the real reason I'd gone there. That won one of our Best Tall Building in the World awards a few years ago for 100 meters and below. And I think that project is absolutely incredible, yeah? What to do with an existing building, with all that carbon locked into the existing building, to bring it back into life. It's an old grain silo, but create something incredible, almost better than you would if you started from a blank piece of paper. So I spent most of the rest of the day at the Museum of Contemporary Art on the roof getting drunk because I'd slid down this hill on my arse. Anyway, we've got a lot to get through. So I'm the tall building guy. I lead the organization called the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. We're based in Chicago. I have particular views on tall buildings, which I'm going to share with you in a minute. I would say that our organization, which was founded in 1969, it's not really about tall buildings. It's not just about tall buildings. It's about urban density, sustainability, and the future of cities. And that's what I'm going to try and get across today. Let's start with some trends. Some of these you may know, but you might not know the data behind it. Trend number one, tall buildings are getting taller. This is the history of the world's tallest building. The current tallest building in the world is Burj Khalifa in Dubai, 828 meters. So you can see the jumps in the heights of the world's tallest. This is more revealing. This is the average height of the 100 tallest buildings in the world from 1930. So you can see from 1930, the average height of the 100 tallest buildings in the world is now tripled. This is not one building. This is 100 buildings has virtually tripled. Yeah, virtually tripled. So tall buildings are getting taller. Number two, there are a hell of a lot more of them. This is a study that we do based on tall buildings 200 meters or greater. By the way, I'm not saying a tall building is 200 meters or greater. 15 stories can be a tall building in many locations, yeah? It's about height relative to context. It's about you to decide what do you think is a tall building. You know, tall, skyscraper, tallness, these are social terms. They're not technical terms. But this is a study we do on 200 meter plus buildings. So look at that. In the 1980s, the entire world was building about 6 of these buildings per year. Last decade, the world was building 114 of these buildings per year. You know, that is the number of two. By the way, the green here is super tall, meaning 300 meters. And we now have a term. My organization is the body that sets the criteria on which tall buildings are measured and sets the title of world's tallest building or South Africa's tallest building or whatever. So the green here is super tall, 300 meters. And we now have a term called mega tall for 600 meters. There are 3 mega tall buildings in the world right now. But look at this. So this is the total number of tall buildings. Total number of buildings 200 meters and above. 88% of all those buildings in the world were built since 2000. Built in the last 22 years. You know, that's incredible. I gave a presentation about 9/11 and the impact of 9/11. Everyone believed that 9/11 would be the death of the tall building. Well, something like 86% of all tall buildings around the world have been built since 9/11. So it most certainly wasn't the death of the tall building. And I think, you know, some of the immediate reactions to the global pandemic through COVID are also saying, so it'll be the death of cities, the death of tall building. I think it's a reaction that is not going to play out in the long term. Okay, so trend number 2, there's a lot more tall buildings. I just want to put Africa in that context. So at the end of this year, as you can see on that graph, there will be more than 2,000 buildings around the world, 200 meters or greater. Africa has 5. South Africa has 2 of those 2,000 buildings. Yeah, the whole of continental Africa has only 5. Has no super talls, but 2 are under construction. About to complete in Cairo, Iconic Tower, and Ivory Coast, Tour F will be the first 2 super tall buildings on the continent of Africa. Trend 3, a change in location. So the next 3 studies show the 100 tallest buildings in the world at the end of each decade, from 1930 on the left-hand side. So the blue here is North America. You know, even as recently as 1990, 80% or greater of the 100 tallest buildings in the world were in the USA. Now that is 14% and still dropping. The green here is Asia, the brown is Middle East, which, by the way, is continental Asia. So there's been a huge shift in the predominant location of tall buildings from North America to Asia. By the way, Africa doesn't exist on this graph. I think that is going to change massively in the next 20, 30 years. Same study, but now looking at function inside the building. The blue here is all office function. So even 20 years ago, the vast majority of these buildings were all office buildings. Now, green, mixed use. Yellow, residential, brown, hotel. There's been a huge shift from all office to mixed use and residential buildings as the tallest buildings in the world. Structural material for the engineers in the audience, well, for all of us. 1970, 90% of these buildings were built out of all steel. Now 7%. There's been a huge shift towards concrete and composite construction. Steel and concrete acting together, which has major implications for the building industry and the carbon scenario, which I'm going to get onto. So if you predicted the world's tallest building 30, 40 years ago, you'd have said 3 things with certainty. It'll be in the USA, it'll be an all-office building, and it'll be built out of steel. The exact opposite of those 3 statements is now true. It'll be in Asia, another 10, 20 years. I'd say it'll be in Africa. It'll be a mixed-use building, and it'll be built out of composite construction, and maybe in 20, 30 years' time, I'd be saying it'll be built out of mass timber. I'm going to get on to mass timber in a minute. Okay, trend number 6. The motivation behind these buildings has completely shifted, a lot of them. You know, 30, 40, 50 years ago, these buildings were being built by corporations who perhaps wanted to get all their employees in one address and get free branding by calling themselves the Singer Building, the Woolworth Building, Chrysler, Sears, Petronas. Those were the names of the tallest buildings in the world. The scale of this has now shifted. It's not about corporations, or it's not only about corporations. Now cities are using tall buildings to brand themselves in a competitive global market for business and commerce and tourism in the same way that car companies did it in 1920s America. at the tallest, most iconic end. So now these projects are more likely to be called Taipei 101, Burj Dubai, as it was originally envisaged, Mecca Clock Tower, Shanghai Tower, Jeddah Tower. It's like promotion of the city that contains them. Okay, some trends. What's driving it? The classic driver, always been a driver, always will be, return on investment. You get a lot more money, putting, more rentable or saleable space on a plot of land. Driver number 2, the appetite for global icons, which I've just mentioned. We could talk about this all day. Driver number 3, the appetite for safe investments. This big controversy in New York, which you may have heard of, Billionaires Row, 55th Street in New York. They've built these absolutely ultra-tall, ultra-slender buildings with fantastic views overlooking Central Park. These apartments are maybe $50, $60 million to buy an apartment. Nobody lives in them, because they're all being bought mostly as safety deposit boxes from people out of Dubai and other places where they want to get investments in safer environments, financial environments, overseas. And if you can afford to pay $50 million on an apartment and you live in Dubai, you're probably not going to be that bothered about renting it out for the 48 weeks of the year that you can't be there. So these buildings are, often quite empty. Very controversial. Let's move more positively, and this is really what the subject of this presentation is about. What are the positive, why these tall buildings are happening from a more positive viewpoint? Well, here's the base of it. Population growth and urbanization. This is United Nations chart that shows urbanization rates. People moving from rural to city, or being born into cities in places like China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, developing countries. If you only remember one statistic that I say today, this is the statistic to remember, because this is the mind-blowing statistic. There are 1 million people urbanizing on this planet every week for the next 30 years. 1 million people. So where do we put them? Where do we put the 1 million people? That means we need to build the equivalent of Chicago, where I live, every month to accommodate with that urban growth. And really, it's like, do we accommodate them in the horizontal city, the American suburban model, or do we accommodate them in denser, more vertical cities? By the way, it's not only China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, it's also the Western world. This is America, which is also seeing quite significant population growth, but it's not equal. There's a movement from what's called the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. No one actually wants to live in Chicago and New York anymore. They want to live, in Atlanta and Dallas. Look at Dallas there. Dallas projects a population growth of 52,000 people per year. It's not the millions that are urbanizing in China and India, but it's still significant numbers of people. And changing demographics is also driving this. What does that mean? It means people don't like each other as much as they used to. So divorce rate is higher in single family households. There's just a lot of need to house more people than ever. So, the base potential for density and tall buildings is really about land use. 2% of the Earth's surface is occupied by cities. 53% of the world's population currently lives there. And this graph, I think, demonstrates it. This is a study that was done that looks at the relationship between urban density and energy use, predominantly in transport. But if you looked at other sectors, I think it would play out. And really, what it comes down to infrastructure. I was reading the magazine that was produced for this event just before this afternoon, and there's a part of it that somebody said, we could build all the green buildings that we want, and it ain't enough. It ain't enough. It ain't enough. It's about the infrastructure. It's about density, the collective benefits of density, but it's about infrastructure, not just about the single buildings. We need to do the best we can with the buildings, for sure, but it's also about the infrastructure. And if you look at this, one of the most sustainable cities on the planet is Hong Kong. because of the infrastructure. I lived in Hong Kong for several years. Anything that ever had a wheel is a form of public transport. Above ground trains, below ground trains, boats, rickshaws, taxis, trams. As opposed to Houston, if you live in Houston and you need a loaf of bread in the evening, chances are you're getting in a car and driving 3 miles to get it. Sorry if you're from Houston. So really, it all comes down to this. What is more sustainable? Higher urban density, the vertical model, or the horizontal model? Okay. There might be some of you that are thinking, it's not as simple as that. If you're not, I'm just going to tell you, it's not as simple as that. And I'll get on to why in a second. Okay. Right, this is now where it gets interesting. So I lead the Global Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. So you would expect me to get up here and be rah, 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 tall buildings. I'm here to tell you that 95% of tall buildings are absolutely crap, should never have been built around the world. I'm serious, should never have been built. They're not even architecture, in my view. By the way, I'm a professor of art. If we have any of our members in the audience, I just took off my hat with the CTBUH and put on my hat as a professor of architecture so I don't offend anybody. But why? Why do I say this? Because tall buildings, this is what I call the shortfall of tall. They're predominantly designed one of two ways. The commercial box. I'm a professor at IIT in Chicago, the home of Mies van der Rohe. So when I put up this slide, it really pisses off all my colleagues. I'm not criticizing this. This is the Seagram building in New York in 1958. 1958. 60 years later. What the hell? I mean, the vast majority of tall buildings are still exactly that. Are they not? They're still the rectilinear, air-conditioned box, efficient box, completely divorced from all context, physically, environmentally, and culturally. So I'm not criticizing this building. I'm criticizing the hijack of this building because it's such a commercial model. An efficient floor plan extruded through, pick your number, 20, 40, 60, 120 stories. I don't know that this is even architecture. By the way, the skin might have got a little bit more efficient, but it is literally that model. It's not good enough. Here's shortfall number 2. Beautiful. The tall building as an iconic piece of sculpture, designed like any piece of sculpture on a sculptor's table and plonked in the city, and the relationship between the tall building and the city is, I am friggin' beautiful, behold me. I mean, that's it, Who said you could be, there's no social sanctification of that. It's crazy. And cities are becoming menageries. They're becoming zoos with these icons competing against each other. No harmony. This never came to be. It was in the middle of the desert, by the way, which adds even more ridiculousness to the situation. But what is happening is this. Cities are becoming homogenized around the whole world. Some of these cities have thousands of years, hundreds and thousands of years of vernacular tradition in architecture, and that is being swept out of the window for this modern architecture. I mean, back in the 1950s, the basis of modern architecture was a universal architecture. I rebel strongly against that. I think that all architecture should be local. It should be a response to its place. Physically, materially, environmentally, culturally. Should not just be these international icons. Tall buildings, modern architecture, but tall buildings are doing for cities what Starbucks and McDonald's is doing for the dining experience. Seriously, they're homogenizing cities. We need to rebel against that. I am so inspired by this image of Shibam in Yemen. 400-500 years ago, this was really dense. 500 years ago. It was pretty tall as well. And there are no two buildings the same. But there's a harmony about this city. It's a local city. It was built out of the local materials. They got things right in terms of self-shading of streets and channeling of wind. We have lost the ability to do this in our own cities. Okay, so I said 95% of tall buildings are crap. I'm now going to show you some of the buildings in the 5%. Yeah, I'm nailing it out there. taking a risk. You might not agree with me. But I want to show some of the buildings that I think have some good merit. Now, I do this in the context of 10 design principles. So this is how I explain it to my students. I'm not treating you all as students, but rather than just say, hey, this is a nice project and this is another one, I want to get across these ideas about why I think some of these projects are good. So design principle number 1. I've already stated this. Tall buildings should relate to the specifics of place. Specifics of place. There should be a South African vernacular high-rise building that's different to Egypt, that's different to Europe, that's different to North America, in the same way that indigenous architecture is different around the world. Well, how do you do that? Well, indigenous architecture, every single piece of indigenous architecture around the world evolved because of place. Physically, culturally, environmentally, materially. So we need to get back to that. This is by the way, I'm not saying all these projects I'm going to show you are all fantastic. I'm showing them for an idea. So this is Richard Rogers' cheese grater in the center of London. It wasn't designed as a cheese grater. That would be atrocious. Well, let's design a cheese grater. It leans in and it opens up at the base because of particular viewing corridors of St. Paul's Dome and this Grade 2 listed church at the base. Yeah. I mean, the idea I'm trying to get across here is when you put a tall building, any building, but a tall building in a city, the city already has a presence, which should impact the design. Not a developer saying, my brief is to make the most money, or my brief is to create a piece of sculpture that stands out. So buildings should be inspired by the physicality of the existing city. Now, here's an extreme example of that. Remember, I'm not saying that all these projects are great in every way, just getting an idea across. This is an extreme example of a building that it exists because of the physicality of the city. I said physically, environmentally, and culturally. So environmentally, which you're all interested in as part of the Green Building Council South Africa. Environmentally, how do you do that in a tall building? This is an all-glass skin tall building, which I don't necessarily agree with, but a part of it is this solar panels. And you can see here in this diagram that the way the solar panels are arranged within the spandrel panel are there to not only capture the solar, but also the angle of it is such that it blocks out more sun at high angle in summer and lets more of that sun in low angle in winter for more passive gain. Something environmentally. Wind turbines. Now, 15 years ago, everybody got excited about wind turbines. Every tall building is going to have wind turbines on them. There are only 4 tall buildings in the entire world that have wind turbines on them. So, because ultimately, it was shown that it was created a hell of a lot of problems and didn't necessarily generate the energy to even offset the carbon of the wind turbines. But the science behind it was absolutely sound. I'm not going to talk a lot about science, but you see that diagram? The power coming out of a turbine is to the cube of the wind speed going in. So you double the wind speed and you increase the power coming out by a factor of 8. So the science behind it was sound. But unfortunately, it's not happened. Partly because these wind turbines, are kind of Mickey Mouse, really. I mean, they're applied on the building. They're not an integral part of the building. I did a project with my students which really the basis was, if you're going to harness wind energy in tall buildings, you need to harness wind energy in tall buildings. And that's what this project looked to do. By the way, I wanted to show you this other project I did myself. I think this is the only 2 student projects I'm going to show you, but it always makes me laugh a little bit about rainwater recycling. All accreditation systems give points for rainwater recycling. In the context of a tall building, that's usually, the roof of the building. Might be the roof of the podium as well. But think about a tall building. The roof is a negligible area, yeah? And actually, rain doesn't fall like that, especially at height. It falls like that. So if you're serious about recycling rainwater, it's all about the facade, really. It's not about the roof. I said physically, environmentally, culturally. How can a tall building reflect its culture? Well, here is a very literal way, yeah? In Shanghai, Taipei, and Korea, All variations on the Chinese pagoda. This is what I call literal cultural symbolism, taking an element from culture and making it literal. I think it's a step in the right direction. If you picked Jin Mao Tower up and put it in the middle of Johannesburg, everyone would be like, why is that Chinese tower in the middle of Johannesburg? Yes? So at least it's a step in the right direction. I don't know it's the way forward, though. You know, here is another literal cultural symbolism. Zaha Hadid architects, Chinese mountains, you know, evocative forms. You know, I love this project on many levels, Petronas Towers. But if you hear Cesar Pelli talk about this tower when he designed it, he believed it was a Malaysian tower because the plan form of the building was inspired by the Islamic star, which you can see there, yeah? But was that enough? I mean, does anyone ever read a building in plan? It was then extruded through 88 stories of modern steel and glass. I would argue if you put that building in Johannesburg, it would have been, you know, seen as a South African building. Also, don't make the mistake, please, of thinking because a building becomes synonymous with a place, meaning Eiffel Tower, Paris, doesn't necessarily mean that it was inspired by the local culture to begin with. So there's a project about 2 miles from Petronas Towers, which is the same plan form, a Malaysian architect, but it's not just a 2-dimensional game. You know, the brise solaire, the modern Jali screen is brought up into the 3 dimensions, the 3rd dimension, and creates the brise solaire for the curtain wall that sits behind it. And this, you know, tradition of Islamic screening has been carried forward into many buildings and many tall buildings. It's a way of maybe, you know, capturing the culture of the building. Okay, these design principles are not all as long as design principle 1, so don't get worried. Okay, design principle number 2. Tall buildings should vary with height. They should not just be vertical extrusions of an efficient floor plan. I talked about, you know, Seagram building, just this extruded floor plan. They should vary with height. Bjarke Ingels with the court scraper, as he calls it, in Manhattan. Project in Toronto, Bangkok, all real projects. They're not just this extrusion, you know, they've got something else going on. Aqua Tower, Jeannie Gang, tallest building designed by a woman in Chicago. The key point I'm trying to get across here, we need to think about tall buildings in terms of horizons and strata, not just one big extruded thing. You know, the difference between a tall building and a small building is as the building rises up in the city, it potentially opens up a relationship far and wide in the city in the way that a small building can't do. A visual relationship, an environmental relationship with breezes and wind and sun. So that should become the generator of design. You know, here's a simple way to demonstrate that. Project in Vancouver, Bjarke Ingels group again. You know, at the base, he had to deal with this busy road. The busy road wasn't there, you know, at level 60, so it did something else. It morphed. He was designing horizons. And this is just mind-blowing. If you've fallen asleep, just wake up for this one. Wake up for this one. I love this one. Okay, the Burj Khalifa, the external air temperature at the top of the building could be 8 degrees cooler on any given day. The amount of particulate in the air, sand, completely different. The amount of moisture in the air, completely different. Here's what I'm saying. The climate is completely different. You know, as a building profession, we're just about getting to grips with the idea that buildings in a location should relate to their local climate. We've got to grips with that. Well, many tall buildings cut through 3 climate zones. So why the hell are they the same all the way up? If that building cuts through 3 climate zones, shouldn't that impact the program, the form, the skin, the MEP systems? No projects are doing this. Okay, number 3. Tall buildings should introduce more facade opacity and variation texture. It is ridiculous that we are building all glass towers, period, but especially in intense solar environments like the Middle Eastern desert. It's ridiculous. And if we moved away from this fascination with all glass, we'd have a chance for a greater expression in the building. Here's a project in the middle of the Middle Eastern desert by SOM, where the glass was inverted on the inside through these sky gardens that step up. And the building, you might not like it. I'm not even sure I like it. But it feels like, an extrusion of the desert with the materiality. There are several buildings in the Middle East that do that, rather than exposing to the sun with all glass. Not just the Middle East. It's a fantastic project in Mexico City that does the same thing. Shields on the south side with intense solar gain does something different, where it opens up on the north side. I know it's the same here, but different here. And if we moved away from this fascination with all glass, we just have an opportunity for expression that's just far greater. Okay, tall buildings should maximize layers of usage on all systems and materials. Here's a project that won our Innovation Award a few years ago. It's all glass, so not great, but it has what's called a bioskin on the outside. Now, all glass buildings typically have solar shades on the outside. Ridiculous. Why did you do that? You didn't need to do that. You didn't need to build it out of all glass and then waste more carbon to cover up the glass. You didn't need to do that, did you? But this project, the bioskin is a continual ceramic pipe. Continual. So the water that falls on the roof and the nearby park is all pumped up, circulated through the ceramic pipe. When the sun hits it, the water evaporates through the porous ceramic pipe. In doing that, it sucks heat energy out of the atmosphere. So that building there in Tokyo would be, on any given day, several degrees cooler than the all-glass building on the right-hand side. In other words, this building is doing something to counter urban heat island effect. If we did that on a larger scale, we could maybe achieve something with this major problem. Here's another one. John Novell in Sydney. This is a sculptural element called the urban chandelier. It's beautiful. Don't get distracted with the greenery. We'll come on to greenery. The urban chandelier. It's a beautiful sculptural element, but it's more than a beautiful sculptural element. The low-rise block there has mirrors, and the underneath of this urban chandelier also is mirrored. So in summer, the sun bounces down, bounces on the underside of the mirror, and bounces away from the scheme into a nearby park, into the adjacent park. In winter, the angles of the mirrors change. It bounces off the roof, underside, and down through the glass roof of the shopping mall to give passive solar gain in the shopping mall. It's not rocket science, is it? It's not rocket science. I think the world thinks that technologies are going to save us, that we're all screwing up this planet, and technologies are going to come along and save us. We have the technologies. We have the know-how to do it now. If we're going to expend this carbon, we need to give as many uses, not just on buildings, everything, a pen, whatever it is. We need to think, how many layers of usage can we superimpose? Power station in Copenhagen. People can walk all over it. They can friggin' ski down it in winter. They can walk up, they can climb up the outside of it. Saves them getting in a car and driving 300 miles to the nearest mountain. Principle 5, tall buildings should provide significant communal open recreational space. Sky gardens. So we produced this book a couple of years ago, The Space Within, Sky Spaces in Tall Buildings. Significant communal space. So there are many examples of this. The granddaddy of them all is the Commerzbank Norman Foster in Frankfurt. Every single office worker has access to a sky garden that steps, you can see them there, that steps up around this triangular plan. It's a project in Turkey, in Istanbul, which surprised me because I thought it, when I went there and saw it, it looks like just another glass office building. It's not, it's actually residential. And the front garden, every unit has this front garden, shrunk back from the skin. And then, that perhaps the most extreme example is the second tallest building in the world, Shanghai Tower, where the entire height of that 632 meters is wrapped in 18 sky gardens. Communal space, essential. Mass timber. I don't know what the mass timber movement is like here in South Africa. I believe that it's an absolute game changer for the building industry. absolute game changer. Up to this point, the most sustainable building in the world is one that doesn't have to be built. That's helpful, isn't it? Mass timber changes that because steel and concrete takes so much energy to create it. So think about mass timber. Instead of using all that energy to create steel and concrete, the tree is happily producing itself without any of our help and producing itself as a building material. But it's better than that, because while it's producing itself, it's sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. It's sucking that carbon out of the atmosphere. 50% of the tree is carbon. On top of that, the benefits, the human benefits of building out of natural materials, I probably don't need to tell you this, you know all this. It's scientifically proven. Absenteeism is down. Productivity is up. People are happier in those environments. There's also benefits in terms of speed and cost on site. And there's also benefits in terms of managed forest, because of course everything I've said falls down unless you cut the tree down and plant another tree. You know, it's got to be this continual cycle. But it's a game changer because back to, you know, the statement of, against steel and concrete, the most sustainable building is one that doesn't have to be built. Well, now the act of building helps the environment. I know it's simplified because it's not everything out of timber, but it actually helps. So the more timber we produce to build buildings, it's sequestering more carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's like using timber farm as any other crop. Wheat, corn, mass timber. Tallest building in the world, all timber buildings in Norway. 20 stories, 22 stories, I think. By the way, the owner developer of this project spoke at our conference a few years ago. Explained this project, and someone, Q&A, put their hand up and said, well, you say it's all timber, but I've been in the building and I saw some concrete in the floors at the top. And the owner developer said, yeah, we had to put that concrete in or it would have blown up. The whole building would have blown away. It was so light, we needed to damp down the structure. So we put the concrete in later to make it a little bit heavier. That's incredible, yeah? And then someone says, and you've clad the whole building in timber? How can you clad the building in timber, 22 stories in timber? And the owner developer said, what's the problem? We've had stave churches in Norway that have existed for 1,000 years. I think everyone thinks that someone's got to get up there with a bucket of creosote every 2 years and paint it. You know, timber is a far more resilient material than we think on all aspects. Fire, all these aspects, you know? So this is the tallest all timber building in the world, but look at this one. This is the tallest vertically extended. Actually, it's not the tallest. Doesn't matter. It's a very significant vertically extended building. That is over a 1960s shopping mall that had no provision, no redundancy, or little redundancy to extend vertically upwards. But they were able to do that with a mass timber tower. Get an extra 14 stories on top, residential. Okay, so mass timber is massive. How about live mass timber? How about trees? What actually if we use the third dimension to grow trees? Bosco Verticale in Milan. Literally 2 residential towers with bushes and trees. Again, we produced a guide that looked about 15 projects in detail. A large part of them are in Singapore. You know, if you stand still, Singapore's blessed with climate. If you stand still long enough, you're probably going to grow vegetation. But it's not just Singapore, you know. In temperate climates, the vegetation is thick in the summer where you might want to block some of that solar gain, thins out in the autumn and winter and let some of that solar gain in. There's a project in Cyprus. I mean, come on, people. This is fucking exciting, yeah? Look at that building. That's it. This is a piece of architecture that speaks to the age in which we live, not these shit glass towers and stuff that we're throwing up everywhere. Am I right or not? This is beautiful architecture, but it's an architecture of our age that speaks to the challenges that we have. Vegetation in buildings is a great thing, but it can go further. Not just vegetation, vegetables. This is a project in Tokyo that is literally fruit and vegetables grown on the skin of the building and throughout the building. It's an office building, harvested, used in the canteen. And, I said that it's not good to build a building out of all glass. I'm not sure it makes much sense to build it out of 2 skins of glass. By the way, there's a project, double skin facade, a project in Berlin that you can lie down in. That double skin facade of unused space is 6 feet wide. You know, I don't know that that makes sense. But if you were going to, if it does make sense from an environmental viewpoint, tempering the inside and outside environment, natural ventilation, then use it. Don't waste energy to create blinds to block. Use it. The vegetation wants the sun. The people working in that office get that connection to nature. Okay, almost done. This is one of my favorites because I spent 10 years of my life doing a PhD on it, sky bridges. And when I started on this 20 years ago, everyone thought I was crazy. Petronas Towers was probably the only real example. It's a one-off. Well, there are now maybe 100 buildings around the world significantly linked with sky bridges at height. You know, this has been a mainstay of science fiction cinematography from almost the day that the first skyscraper was created. Because to these people that are creating cities of the future, to them it's ridiculous that we go 200 stories without connecting horizontally. Actually, Petronas Towers, the skybridge is part of the fire evacuation. Think 9/11, yeah? Think about all those people trapped in that building that could not get out. Think about the advantages of being able to move horizontally. This saved 1 fire stair in each of those towers. 1 fire stair per floor times 42 stories times 2 towers. There's a hell of a lot of money. Probably finance the sky bridge. But it's more than just bridges. It's more than just circulation bridges. This is 6 or 7 social high-rise towers built in Singapore, linked at 3 levels, with significant urban habitat in the sky. Not just bridge. Urban habitat. That brings me on to this. The roof plane of a tall building is the most valuable space there is. So the highest level, best views, cleanest environment externally. You can plant it. It's outdoor space at height in a tall building. And what do we do in 99% of tall building roofs? We fill it up with crap. We put the lift overrun, satellite dishes, water tanks. Why do we do that? Why do we do that? You know, we should use the roof of the tall building. Still has the lift overrun rooms, but you can use the space. Maybe you can do more than just put some planting in between the lift overruns. You know, and then if you take the idea of the roof and the sky bridge and link it together, then you get this, which is just phenomenal to sit in this urban plane at the 50th level. These are all real projects I'm showing you. This is incredible, this project in Singapore. You know, look down on it. What have they done here? They've managed to put 3,000 people living on a plot of land and recreate the original green area of the site 3 times in the sky. That's what we should be doing with cities, isn't it? And number 10, final principle, we need to bring all aspects and functions of a city up into the sky. This is a high-rise school. You know, most tall buildings, residential, hotel, office, or some mix of those things. That's not a city. This is a high-rise school in Tokyo. There's another project in Japan. The list of functions inside this building is incredible in Korea. Okay, so to finish, I want to bring this all together, reconsidering the vertical city. So, imagine this. This is an existing city, low-rise or mid-rise city. Existing low-rise or mid-rise city. What I want you to concentrate on here is anything in color. Anything in color represents infrastructure. Remember I talked about the infrastructure is so important. Infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I don't just mean linear infrastructure. I don't mean mass transit, water, sewage, lighting. I do mean all those things, but I mean social infrastructure. Garden, park, sidewalk, doctor's surgery, shop, school, social infrastructure. It is all 100% at the ground floor. Might be a little bit below the ground, a bit above, but it's all at the ground floor. Okay, that city's going from 1 million to 10 million people in the next 20 years. That is not science fiction. That is happening all around the world. Where do those 9 million people go? Can't go in the ever-expanding horizontal city. Doesn't make sense sustainability-wise. It just, the land use, the energy to create and operate that city just doesn't stack up against this backdrop of 1 million people urbanizing on the planet every day. No. So, there we go. Beautiful. No. No, because every white box there is office, residential, or hotel. That's not a friggin' city. No. So we need to think about the tall building as that 2D infrastructure-rich ground plane flipped vertically. With the infrastructure, with the parks, with the sky gardens, with the green, with the 10 principles that I just talked to you about. And then linked together, perhaps with sky bridges. And this is, what I talk about with my students is sustainable vertical urbanism. I'm not saying this is going to happen in Cape Town. I'm not saying it's going to happen in established cities, but there are a lot of cities that are growing, with these millions of people. Maybe this is a way forward. I always get asked this, so I'll finish by saying this, but who pays for it? Nice idea, Antony, professor in an ivory tower. Okay, who pays for all that shit? The government, out of taxes. Who pays for the infrastructure right now? The owner developer doesn't, the architect doesn't. The government does, out of taxes. Well, we just put 9 million more taxes. So these buildings need to become public-private partnership, where the government, out of taxes, is paying for the park or the whatever, in the same way they would at the ground floor. And that would really help in terms of, increasing the whole agenda of this connected three-dimensional vertical urbanism. So really what I've talked about is, what is the future of sustainable cities? Is it the American model on the left? Everyone living on a quarter-acre plot of land? Is it the Middle Eastern model? Actually, that's unfair on the Middle East. Is it like a lot of cities, the menagerie of competing icons? Or is it about this dense vertical urbanism? I wanted to take 1 minute to just tell you about my organization, the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. Founded in 1969. We have more than 2 million people plugged into our network around the whole world. Multidisciplinary. So 26% of our member base is owner, developer, funder, followed by engineering, architecture, construction, materials, government. Everybody involved in the creation of cities and tall buildings are a part of our network. None of you are. I'm hoping you're going to help me change that. Here is the world according to us. We have 3 offices. Headquarters in Chicago. We have an office in Shanghai and an office in Venice, Italy. There's a story about that. Not a lot of tall buildings in Venice. It's a story I'll tell you about another day. But we also have active chapters around the whole world. But look at that big grey area there right in the middle. Look at that big grey area right in the middle. We have almost no representation, almost nothing going on in Africa. And part of the reason that I accepted this invitation, biggest reason was to come back to Cape Town, but a part of it was to try and change that. So I'm going to be here for the next 2 days. You'll see me because I've got no friends, don't know anybody. So I'm going to be Billy No Mates with my coffee. Please come and talk to me. If you want to help me change this, if you're interested in the things I've talked about, if you see that Africa is the next, it's going to be the next Asia in terms of urban development, then come and talk to me about that. And there's my email address, awood@ctbuh.org. Okay, thank you.